is a moment in any long deployment when you stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what you are. You stop correcting the record. You stop bristling when they talk past you in briefings. You learn to carry the insult like you carry any other piece of kit. Wear it long enough, and it stops weighing anything at all. I had been carrying Krathsev's contempt for 41 days by the time he stood in the center of the training yard and said what he said. 41 days. I had it down to a science by then. I should back up. Coalition Station Keth sits on a high mesa above a river delta, a joint installation that had been operating for 9 years before my unit ever set foot on it. The mesa is basalt, old volcanic flow, worn flat by wind over centuries, and the station is built directly into it. Prefabricated human modules bolted to Vereth stone construction that had been standing for 3 decades. The Vereth had been the senior partner from the beginning. That was simply the arrangement. They were the species with the longest operational history in this sector, the longest treaties, the longest institutional memory, and they were not shy about any of it. I want to be precise about the Vereth, because I have heard them described badly by people who reduce them to the obvious things. They are large. The smallest adult male Vereth I ever stood beside was a head taller than me and had forearms the diameter of my thighs. They are covered in a dense, layered hide that runs from gray-green on the flanks to near black along the ridge of the spine, and the hide is not soft. It has the texture of old boot leather left in the sun, thick enough that a standard combat blade would require serious leverage to penetrate. Their eyes are positioned laterally, wide-set, excellent peripheral vision, and are a pale amber that catches light in a way that always made me feel, when they looked at you directly, that they were doing you a courtesy by bothering. They are also disciplined, more disciplined than I had expected. The rank-and-file Varath soldiers on Keth were professionals in every meaningful sense. Their equipment was maintained, their rotations were crisp, their communications were precise. They had protocols for everything, logged everything, enforced everything with a consistency I found almost admirable. They did not drink during duty cycles. They did not gamble. They held formation. I had been on joint installations before, with species that treated the coalition's shared facilities as an opportunity for their own peoples, comfort at everyone else's expense. The Vereth were not like that. They pulled their weight and kept their area, and showed up when they said they show up. The Velkarath are a different matter. The Velkarath are the warrior caste of the ruling houses. Ancient by the standards of Vereth. Institutional history, which means very old indeed. Their function once, to serve as personal champions of the matriarchs who governed the Verethicity clusters. To fight duels, to stand at thresholds, to carry out the martial will of the houses, in a manner that was considered appropriately ceremonial. That has been formalized over many generations into something security consultancy and a living piece of cultural theater. When a house sends a Velkarath to a joint installation, they are sending someone whose entire professional life has been structured around the idea that the measure of a fighter is visible, in scars, in posture, in the particular way they move through a room. Everything they know about combat has been filtered through 6 centuries of house tradition that prizes legibility. A wound you received and survived is an honor wound. It tells a story, it goes on record. They have a term for it, Vethkale, which translates roughly as marked by having answered. The Velkarath Krathsev had more Vethkale than any Vereth I had seen. His left forearm carried a long diagonal scar that ran from below the elbow to the outer edge of the wrist. Deep and clean, the kind of cut made by something with a serious edge. And there were 3 parallel marks along the left side of his jaw, evenly spaced, which I learned from the cultural exchange documentation, were made by a specific type of Vereth grappling technique that leaves exactly that pattern when it connects and the recipient does not move quickly enough. His right shoulder had a thickening of scar tissue across the front deltoid, that is, the result, in Velkarath tradition of having stopped something with your body that would otherwise have continued past you to something worse. Each mark had a story. Each story had a house record. Each record established formally and irrevocably, Krathsev had been tested and had answered. He wore them the way a man wears a decoration, not with vanity, with information. Krathsev arrived at Keth Heron on day 3 of my unit's rotation, attached to us as what the station commander described, with a straight face, as an assessment liaison. What that meant in practice was that Krathsev attended our morning formations, our equipment reviews, our combat readiness briefings, and every training block we ran in the station's open yard, and wrote reports on what he observed. Technically, he reported to the Vareth station commander. In practice, his reports went to the house that had sent him, which meant they went to people with a political interest in the question of whether human units were worth the logistical overhead they represented, on a station that had been, for 9 years, a Vareth operation with human attachment. I am not making him a villain. He was doing his job as he understood it, and as his tradition had shaped him to understand it. But his tradition had also shaped him to be openly certain, within the first week, that we were not serious fighters. Said this directly to our company commander, Colonel Vesherath, in a briefing on day 9. Not cruelly, the way a man tries to wound. Observationally, the way a man reports a measurement. Your soldiers have no honor wounds, he said. I have watched them for 9 days. Not one carries a visible mark. Either they have not been tested, or they heal too quickly to carry the proof. Herath is a patient man. He thanked Krathsev for the observation. Krathsev spent the next 32 days compiling evidence for the conclusion he had already reached. He was thorough. He attended a training session, and he watched with the quality of attention that professionals give to things they expect to confirm their existing analysis, which is a different quality than the attention you give when you expect to be surprised. It is a shallower angle. It sees what it is looking for and moves on. He asked questions, procedural, precise questions, the kind that are designed to expose gaps, and he logged the answers with a stylus in a small flat recorder he kept in his belt pouch. Recorder was old, worn at the corners, with a surface that had been resealed at least once. He had been doing this for a long time. He was polite in the way that a man is polite when he has already made up his mind and sees no reason for theatrics. He never raised his voice. He never sneered. He never delivered the contempt with any particular edge or relish. I think that would have made it easier to carry. He simply watched us with those pale amber eyes and wrote things down. And every 2 or 3 days he would say something to whoever was nearest to him that amounted to the same observation he had made on day 9. We were not serious fighters, because serious fighters carried the evidence of having been tested, and we carried nothing visible, and therefore the evidence was absent. The soldiers in my unit developed a range of responses to him over those 32 days. Some of them avoided his vicinity during formation and exercises, not out of fear, but out of the particular weariness that comes from being perpetually evaluated and found wanting by someone who has not updated their criteria in centuries. Few of them tried the opposite, positioned themselves where Krathsev could see them during training, ran their drills with an extra crispness, tried to show him what competence looked like in the hope that he would recalibrate. He logged what he saw and did not recalibrate. He was looking for could not be shown in a drill. Drills do not leave marks. Corporal Rendashi, who was 19 years old and the youngest member of my squad, spent a week trying to engage Krathsev in conversation after the evening meal. Not confrontationally, just as the kind of genuine inquiry a young person makes when they are trying to understand something that does not make sense to. He asked Krathsev questions about the Velkrath tradition, about what the Vethkale system meant, about why the marks mattered more than the capacity to perform. Krathsev answered him each time, patiently at length, in the careful Galactic common that was Krathsev's second language, and Dashi's first. The answers were always the same answer in different words. Without the mark, there is no evidence of the test. Without the evidence, the test might not have happened. The record is the thing that makes the event real. Dashi reported back to me one evening, on the edge of his bunk, the expression of a person who has tried every entry point to a locked building and found them all sealed. He's not wrong about how his system works, Dashi said. He's just decided his system is the only system. That's usually how it goes, I said. How long do we just absorb it? I thought about it. Until the ledger says otherwise, I said. He accepted that. He was a good soldier, Dashi. He went back to his kit. By day 41, I had stopped finding Krathsev's contempt interesting. It had become part of the texture of the deployment, like the quality of the food in the station mess, which was better than field rations, and worse than anything you'd eat voluntarily at home. You accommodated it. You did not love it. You did not think about it more than necessary. The Knuckle split on day 38. We were running a close-quarters exercise in the station's interior corridors. Tight passages, gear on, simulated kit weights that added about 12 kilograms to each soldier's movement. And I came around a corner too fast, misjudged the width of the passage by a small margin, and drove my right hand into a door frame at a bad angle. The middle finger knuckle split across the first joint. Not badly, not a fracture, just a clean split in the skin that bled more than it warranted and swelled enough to make a full fist uncomfortable for the rest of the exercise. I finished the exercise. I cleaned the wound that evening, saline, standard field dressing, nothing dramatic, and put a bandage on it that held overnight, and by morning was in the way enough that I replaced it with 2 strips of white athletic tape, the half-inch kind, thin and strong, wrapped twice around the joint, snug enough to keep the skin closed under pressure without restricting the blood. The tape was in my breast pocket. I had been carrying a small roll of it since the second week of the deployment, the same way I carry a length of paracord and a folded piece of emery cloth and 3 cable ties. Things that weigh nothing and solve a category of small problems before they become larger ones. I taped it on day 39 and kept the tape on through day 40. By morning of day 41, the skin had closed down to a thin red line still tender if you pressed directly on it, but closed. I left the tape off that morning to let it breathe. That was all. I was not making any particular statement about the wound. I was letting it heal. On day 41, we ran a formation review in the open training yard at noon. The yard is a flat expanse of flagstone, maybe 40 meters square, open to the sky on 3 sides with the barracks wall on the 4th. Noon in the latitude of Ketharen is direct and hard. No angle to the light, no shadow to speak of. The kind of sun that makes everything look slightly flattened and very clear, the way a photograph looks when the exposure is exactly right and there is nothing to interpret, just the thing itself. There was no wind. The flagstone radiates heat at that hour. You can feel it coming up through the soles of your boots if you stand still long enough. My unit was in 2 ranks, 63 soldiers. Equipment laid out in front of each of them for Krathsev's weekly walkthrough, which was the part of his assessment that everyone in the unit had identified as the most reliably draining, not because it was difficult. Krathsev never found anything substantially wrong with our equipment condition, because our equipment was good, and we kept it that way. But because it was slow, and because slowness in that context had a particular quality. He moved down the line with his recorder, pausing at each soldier's kit, asking questions, writing things down. The questions were never hostile. They were worse than hostile. They were patient. He got to me at the end of the first rank, paused, looked at my kit, wrote something, and then looked at my hands. I had them at my sides, standard parade rest, fingers slightly curled. The knuckle was bare. The thin line of the healing split was visible if you were looking for it, but it was subtle. 3 days of tape had done its work, and unless you had seen a fresh split before, you might have taken it for an ordinary skin marking, or missed it entirely. Krathsev looked at my hands for 2 or 3 seconds, which is longer than the incidental glance, but shorter than a deliberate examination. Then he moved on to the second rank without saying anything. I registered it and let it go. When the walkthrough was finished, he stood in front of the formation and delivered his weekly summary, practice he had established on day 15 and maintained without variation. Equipment condition, formation discipline, training response metrics. All of it accurate, all of it adequate, most of it, if I am being precise, not unkind. He said what the numbers said. The numbers were not bad. They were simply not accompanied by the credential he kept returning to. I have observed this unit for 41 days, he said. I have noted their discipline, their equipment practice, their formation consistency. These are adequate. A question remains that 41 days has not resolved. Among 63 soldiers, I have observed 0 honor wounds. Not one visible scar that reads as the mark of a serious engagement. I have asked several soldiers about their service histories. The histories are long. The gaps are, to a Velkarath assessor, puzzling. A soldier with 12 years of active service and no visible mark is either extremely fortunate, is a soldier who has not been tested in a way that required answering. I do not yet know which category applies here. He paused. Then he said, I am willing to know. If any soldier in this unit has been tested and answered, I would welcome the demonstration. Not a simulation. A demonstration. He did not make it a challenge in the traditional Velkarath sense. There was no formal declaration, no house invocation, no ritual framing, no drawing of anything. He just in the center of the yard in the noon sun with his arms loose at his sides and waited. It was not a threat. It was closer to a genuine question asked by a man who had found every other avenue of inquiry insufficient. 63 soldiers held formation. I was aware of Harith standing off to the right at the edge of the yard, very still, with his hands clasped behind his back. I was aware of Corporal Dashi. 3 soldiers to my right in the first rank, not moving. I was aware of the heat of the flagstone, and the flatness of the noon light, and the particular silence that had settled over the yard. Was not hostile and not afraid, just waiting. I stepped forward. I broke the rank and walked to the center of the yard. I am not going to tell you it was a long walk, because it was not. The formation was 20 meters from where Krothsev stood, and I covered that distance in about 15 seconds. But it was the kind of 15 seconds that takes longer to carry than it does to cross. Every step was the next step, and the next step after that, and the choice of each one was the same as the last. And at the end of them, I stopped 3 meters in front of a Velkarath honor fighter, who had been training for his entire professional life and outweighed me by roughly 65 kilograms. I reached into my breast pocket and took out the roll of athletic tape, pulled 2 strips, each about 15 centimeters, the length I had settled on over 3 days of working with the wound, and wrapped them around my right middle finger knuckle, once around, anchored at the base of the joint, twice snug end tucked under. It took 8 seconds. I had done it enough times by then that I could do it by feel, without looking at my hands, the way you do anything you have done enough times for the hands to know the task better than the eyes do. I put the roll back in my breast pocket. I made a fist, tested the pull of the tape across the joint. It held, clean and firm, the way it had each morning, and opened my hand again. Sev watched all of this. I know now. I have had years to think about what was happening in those 8 seconds on both sides of the equation, that what he was seeing was something his training had no specific category for. The Velkarath tradition of honoring wounds involves ceremony. A wound that has been received and survived and commemorated is marked with something permanent. A notch in the fighting hide along the standard points of the body, an inked entry in the house record, sometimes a brief formal acknowledgement issued by the matriarch or her designated representative. What none of this involves is a person taking 2 strips of thin athletic tape from their breast pocket and wrapping a working wound like they are, preparing for a task they intend to finish before dinner. The tape was not ceremony. It was not commemoration. It was a splint for a split that had not stopped the work and was not going to stop this. It was the most efficient possible thing, and efficiency, in the Velkarath framework, is not the point of the wound at all. I think he thought I was performing something. I think he was waiting to see what the performance was for. He dropped into his fighting stance. The Velkarath base, which I had seen him demonstrate to the assembled coalition officers on day 12 as part of a cultural exchange briefing. Wide stance, weight distributed to the rear leg, both arms raised and held at slightly different heights, the left further out and higher, the right closer in and lower, which is the guard structure for a fighter whose body favors the forward hip drive that Velkarath use to initiate their primary strikes. It is a good stance for a Velkarath. It is a complete and coherent system built over 6 centuries of fighting in a certain body against fighters of a certain kind, and it is very good at what it is designed for. I put my hands up in something that would not have impressed anyone. It never looks like much from the outside. We had about 3 meters of space between us when he moved. He closed that distance in under a second. Velkarath close fast. I had read this in the documentation, and watching him on day 12 had given me a useful sense of the actual speed. And he led with a front sweep, a lateral clearing motion that I had also seen him demonstrate, designed to displace a smaller opponent's guard and create an opening for the forward. I moved off the line, not far, enough. What followed was not a clean story. I want to be honest about this, because what people want from a story like this is a clean line. Challenge, response, victory, the alien's expression of dawning respect. The reality of standing in front of someone who is significantly larger than you and significantly more experienced in a formal combat tradition is that the line is not clean, and the word victory is a retrospective description of a condition that did not feel like victory at any point during process. It felt like a problem requiring an immediate solution, and then another, and then another. Sev hit me 4 times before I found what I was looking for. The first hit caught my left forearm as I moved to block a strike aimed at my jaw. I got the block, but the force of his strike was enough that even a blocked version of it transmitted through the forearm into the shoulder and, briefly numb, a bloom of vibration that ran from the wrist to the collarbone and then faded. The second was a body shot, forward drive that I partially stepped back from, but not far enough, and it caught the left side of my rib cage with enough of his weight behind it that I felt the immediate message from the ribs, which was, "Those are not broken, but they are going to be discussing this for a while." The third I mostly slipped, but his reach is what his reach is, and the outer edge of his strike clipped the side of my head with enough force to wipe my vision for about half a second, which is a long time when someone is still in motion in front of you. Fourth one I did not feel at the time at all. When you don't feel a hit, it either missed or it landed in the wrong place, and this one had not missed. None of them put me down. I want to be precise about why, because the answer is not interesting, and it matters that it is not interesting. I did not stay up because I am exceptional. I stayed up because I had spent 12 years in gymnasiums and mats and training facilities that smelled like rubber and old sweat, training with people who did not pull their hits, because the logic of that kind of training is explicit. If you learn to absorb in practice, you absorb in application. You build the habit deep enough that it is not a decision anymore. A decision takes time. What you need when Krathsev's second strike lands on your ribs is not a decision. It is a response that was already there waiting, preloaded instruction from the nervous system that says, orient, breathe, find the next thing. That instruction has to be older than the moment it is needed, or it is not there when you reach for it. The other thing I want to be honest about is what Krathsev was doing during those 4 exchanges. He was not being careless. He was not underestimating me in the way that gets people in stories like this into trouble. The villain too confident to fight seriously, the fatal pause of pride. He was fighting seriously and correctly within his system, and his system was very good. What he was doing was reading me the way a trained fighter reads an unfamiliar opponent. Looking for information about what kind of threat I was, exchanges I was willing to take, which I was trying to avoid, where my weight went when I committed. He was patient about it. He was investing the first exchanges in data collection, which is the professional thing to do. He was not wrong to do it. Problem was that his data collection framework was built for a certain kind of opponent, the same way his fighting system was. He was looking for information that a Vareth opponent would have given him. Information about feint preferences, about guard angles, about the specific timing signatures of attacks generated by a body with his geometry. He was very good at reading that information and doing something with it. What I was giving him was different enough that some of it was not landing in the categories he had. He was adapting because he was a professional and professionals adapt, but adaptation takes a moment, and the moment matters. What I was reaching for, underneath the work of staying upright and online, was an angle. The Velkarath tradition, I had read the cultural exchange documentation on day 647 pages of it, because I read documentation before I do anything else, developed in an environment where Vareth fought Vareth, against opponents of similar height and similar geometry. Against that geometry, the Velkarath system is formidable in the way a lock is formidable. It fits exactly the situation it was designed for, and it has been refined over centuries of application against exactly that situation. Against an opponent of the same height and similar reach, it cover every line. Against an opponent who is 62 kilograms and 5'7" and willing to stay close and low, there is a gap. Gap is at the inner forward knee. It requires you to have already been hit enough times that the opponent has found his rhythm, because you need him committed to the rhythm. You cannot exploit a gap in someone who is still adjusting. You need him to have settled into the pattern of his tradition, because the pattern is what creates the gap. His tradition was very good, and the pattern ran deep, and fourth exchange he had found what he thought he was looking for in me, which was that I could absorb, but I could not generate sufficient force to threaten him from the outside. That assessment was accurate. I was not going to win from the outside. He had committed to that understanding. He had settled by the fourth exchange. On the fifth, he led with the same high sweep he had opened with, the lateral clear, the same motion, and I went low and inside, underneath the sweep, and I hit the inner surface of his forward knee with my body weight, moving across and through it, shoulder first, driving into the space behind the joint as I continued moving past. The physics of it are simple. A knee that is weight-bearing forward has a specific range of tolerance for lateral force at the inner surface. That range ends at a point. I had moved my weight into that point from the correct angle, and I kept moving after contact because so stopping transfers less force than continuing. A Velkareth knee does not bend inward. Nothing in 6 centuries of house tradition had ever required it to. He went down on the flagstone. It was not a controlled fall. The Velkarath learned to fall correctly. They trained the recovery roll as a fundamental, the same way a judoka trains the ukemi, and under different circumstances Krathsev would have caught himself and come back to his feet in a single, fluid motion. The reason he did not was that the joint gave before his training could catch up with what was happening, which meant that the trained response arrived at the wrong moment and contributed to the confusion rather than resolving it. He hit the flagstone on his side and one hand and the impact sound of a Velkarath hitting stone. The weight of him, the density of the hide, was the loudest sound in the yard. And then it was very quiet. I stepped back. I did not stand over him. That was not the point, and had never been the point. I gave him 3 meters of space and stood with my hands at my sides and waited. He was still for 4 seconds, then 5, then 6. On the 7th second he moved, slow, the way a person moves when they are taking inventory of themselves. He got a hand under his weight, then the other, then pushed himself to a sitting position on the flagstone. He did not try to stand immediately. He put one hand on the stone in front of him, flat, and the other hand he moved to his knee, and he assessed the distance with the methodical calm of a professional who has been damaged before and knows how to take the report. I was doing my own inventory at the same time. The ribs on the left side were going to be a problem for a few days. Not a serious problem, nothing that was going to require anything beyond a compression wrap and time, but a persistent one, the kind that announces itself every time you breathe deeper than you need to, and asks whether you have considered breathing shallower. The shoulder had come back fully while we were still in it, which was good. The head was clear. The hand with the tape on it had not been hit. I had used it for grip and control, not for striking, which was what I had planned, because the tape will hold a healing split under grip force better than under impact force. 2 strips is enough for the former and marginal for the latter. The planning had held. The tape had held. I could hear the yard around us. No one in the formation had moved. 63 people standing in the noon sun is not silence. It is breath and the small involuntary sounds of 63 people simultaneously not doing anything else. Krathsev looked up. His amber eyes found mine. They held them. Then they moved, slowly and with intention, to my right hand. He was looking at the tape. I stood still and let him look at it. Realizing what tape does. It was keeping the skin of the split knuckle closed under the stress of the last 2 minutes. There was a small spot of red at the edge of one strip where the wound had wept, not much, a thin line of it at the seam where the second strip met the first. Not dramatic. The kind of thing that happens when a 3-day-old split is asked to work harder than it has been working. The wound had not opened. Tape had held. He looked at the tape for a long time. I do not know with any certainty what was happening in the space between his looking at it what he said next. I know what I believe was happening, which is that he was running a sequence backward. From the red spot at the seam, to the tape, to the breast pocket, to the moment 8 seconds before we started, when I pulled 2 strips from the roll and wrapped them, to the question that moment implied. He had watched me wrap the tape. He had not understood in the moment why I was wrapping it instead of having wrapped it already, before the demonstration. He was understanding it now. He said something in Vareth, low, in his own language. I did not know what it was. I found out later. It translates as something between a legal acknowledgement and a term formal. Witness. Closer to the record notes this than to IC. Not addressed to me. Not addressed to anyone in the yard. Addressed in the way that Velkareth formal language is addressed. To the house record that did not yet exist but would. Then he put his palm back on the flagstone and began the work of standing up. Colonel Hireth crossed the yard. He walked at his standard pace, which is unhurried in the way that only very experienced people can be unhurried in a situation that has just produced an outcome nobody planned for. He came to stand beside me, with his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at Krath Sev, with the expression I had learned over 3 years to read. I'm watching this, and I will understand it eventually. That'll be in the report, Herath said quietly. It will, I said. Good, he said, and he walked back. Krathsev got himself to standing. He tested the knee, slow, deliberate. The exact methodical check of someone who knows the joint, and knows what a stressed joint feels like, and is taking an honest measurement, was operational. He would have swelling and probably ligament strain. I knew from the cultural exchange documentation that Vareth recovery rates, joint injuries, are considerably faster than human rates, which is one of the advantages of a biology that has spent a long time in environments that regularly damage it, and I was not concerned about permanent harm. I had not been trying to cause permanent harm. I had been trying to end the exchange at the point where it had said what it needed to say. He looked at me. Something in his eyes was different, not soft. Krathsev's eyes were never soft. They were a working instrument like everything else about him, but reorganized. The way a map looks when it has been redrawn to include a feature it did not have before. The wound was already there, he said, in galactic common. Flat, observational. Like he was confirming a measurement. 3 days ago, I said. You wrapped it before stepping out. The tape was in my pocket. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were still on my hand. You came to the yard already prepared for it to open, he said. I came to the yard, I said. That was the distinction. I had not come to the yard because I thought the wound might open. I had taped the wound because wounds that are not closed will open under stress. And I had come to the yard because the ledger needed settling, and those two things had overlapped. There was no particular foresight in it. The tape was in my pocket because the tape was always in my pocket, and the pocket was always there, and the knuckle was healing but not done healing. And I had taped it as a matter of course before stepping out into the noon sun to do something that would involve my hands. He looked at the tape, the small red line at the seam. No ceremony, he said. No, I said. He looked at the formation behind me, then at me. Then he bent his head forward, slightly briefly, the Velkarath acknowledgement of a Vethkale, not deep, not theatrical. The inclination of a head that means the record has been marked. Addressed not to the person carrying the wound, but to the wound itself, in the Velkarath system, is the correct way of making it real. He had just given my taped knuckle the only formal recognition a Velkarath is trained to give. I did not know what to do with that, so I did what I do when I do not know what to do. Nothing. Stood still, and let it be what it was. That was the afternoon of day 41. Port Krathsev wrote that evening was 6 pages, longer than his weekly summaries by 2 pages, and more densely written. Flat, precise Velkarath, evidentiary style, claim supported by observation supported by conclusion. I did not read it. I do not have clearance for interhouse documentation. What I know about its contents comes from Hirath, briefs, the relevant section by the Vareth station commander on day 43. Herath told me about it on the evening of that day, at the rail of the station's east observation deck, in the long sunset light. He had a cup of bad coffee. I had the same bad coffee. Below the mesa, the river delta was going gold. The report, Herath said, made 2 arguments. The first, Human soldiers assigned to Keth were fully qualified for joint operational duties. The evidence, he cited, covered the formation discipline, the equipment condition, the response metrics, and the combat demonstration of Day 41. Standard evidentiary format. Clean, accurate, professionally unsurprising, given what he had observed over 6 weeks. The second argument was less standard. What Krathsev had written, in the section Hereth described to me carefully, translating from the briefing he had received from the Verith station commander who had been translating from the Velkarath report document, was something like this: that the Velkarath tradition of honor wounds had operated 6 centuries on the assumption that wounds become meaningful through commemoration, that a wound received, survived, formally marked is the credential. Without the marking, the wound has no standing. The mark is the thing that makes it real in the record, and the record is the thing that makes it real at all. What he had observed in the training yard was a wound that had been received and survived and put back to work immediately, without commemoration, without marking, without the ceremony that would have made it visible to the framework that was looking for it. It had been taped over and kept functional for 3 days. It had been rewrapped 8 seconds before a demonstration that the wound's carrier intended to win. The wound had not been made into anything. It had been treated as a piece of kit that needed a field repair and had received one. He did not know what to call this, the report said. In the Velkarath framework, the wound was not a Veth Kale when it was inflicted. There had been no house record, no acknowledgement, no ceremony. It became a Veth Kale only when he acknowledged it in the yard, which made the acknowledgement retroactive, which created a logical problem. How can a wound be answered before anyone declared it answerable? He noted this as an unresolved discrepancy and recommended further study. I thought about that on the observation deck while the delta went from gold to deep amber below us. He gave your Knuckle a Veth Kale, Hereth said. He did, I said. In the report he calls it the most efficient honor wound he has assessed. Hereth drank his coffee, no ceremony, minimum overhead, tape and work. That's all it was, I said. He's asking the house to extend the assessment period, Hereth said. Another 60 days. I looked at the river. He wants to see what else he missed, Hereth said. I did not say anything. The situation had said it already. The extended assessment was different from the first 41 days. Different in quality, not in quantity. Krathsev still attended formations, still ran walkthroughs, still kept the recorder in his pouch and wrote things down, but the questions changed. He had spent 41 days asking questions designed to find what was absent. He spent the next 60 asking questions designed to understand what was present. He asked about decision-making under degraded conditions. He asked about how soldiers in my unit assessed their own readiness. He asked about the logic of field repairs, not just to kit but to bodies, plans, to relationships within a unit when something went wrong. He was trying to understand the framework, not confirm the absence of a feature the framework did not use. Corporal Dashi came to me on day 58 of the extension, pleased in the careful way of a young person who has decided not to show how pleased they are. He asked me today, Dashi said, about the door frame. Looked at him. He asked what I do when I injure my hand in a passage and the exercise isn't finished. I told him I finished the exercise. He asked what I do after. I told him I tape it if it needs tape or I leave it if it doesn't. And he wrote it down, Dashi said. He wrote it down, and he asked me how I know when it needs tape. What did you tell him? Told him it needs tape when it's going to open under work, and it doesn't need tape when it's just going to hurt. Dashi shrugged. The shrug was doing work. He wrote that down too. They were better conversations than the ones Dashi had tried to have in the first weeks, because Krathsev had changed his framework. I do not think 6 centuries of house tradition revises itself in 60 days, but because he had found a question the framework could not answer on its own, and that question was functioning as a door. A door he had opened himself in the training yard and was now walking through at his own pace. On the last day of the extended assessment, he came to find me in the equipment room. I was doing an end-of-rotation gear check, systematic, slightly tedious, working through each piece of kit in order, the way you do at the end of a long deployment when you want to hand off clean. He stood in the doorway for a moment. then came in and stood near the workbench. He looked at my hands. The knuckle had been healed for weeks. There was a thin scar along the joint, the kind you get from a split held closed with tape rather than stitched, which leaves a finer line than stitching would, slightly paler than the surrounding skin. Barely visible. Not nothing. No tape today, he said. Doesn't need it, I said. He looked at the scar for a moment, then at the gear on the workbench. Then he took out his recorder and wrote something in it, and put it back in his pouch. He walked out. The final report, the complete assessment, the one that went to the house, I did not read. What I know is that human units at Keth Haran confirmed for expanded joint operations the following quarter, and that the recommendation came with language the Vareth station commander described to Hirath as unusually favorable. The exact phrasing that was relayed to us was, "They prepare for the wound before the wound arrives, and they do not stop to observe it once it has." I do not know whether Krathsev wrote that, or whether it was the house's synthesis of his report. It does not matter. What I kept was the tape, not the specific roll. I used that up over the deployment and replaced it twice. But the practice, the half-inch athletic tape, thin and strong, small roll in the breast pocket. I carry it the way I carry the paracord and the emery cloth and the 3 cable ties. Things that weigh nothing and solve a category of problem before it becomes larger than it needs to be. It is not a ritual. It is not a tribute. It is just a useful thing to have. The scar is still there, faded to the point where you would miss it if you did not know to look. It is not a Veth-Kale in any formal sense. Krathsev's acknowledgement was given in a training yard, and not entered in any house record I have access to, and whatever weight it carries in the Velkarath system is the weight of a private accounting rather than an official credential. I have not tried to make it more than it was. But I think about what he said, there on the flagstone in the noon sun, when he understood that the wound had been 3 days old when I stepped out of the rank. The wound was already there. Yes, it was. It had been there since day 38, since the doorframe, since the moment I cleaned it and taped it, and went back to finish the exercise. Because the exercise was not finished, and the tape was in my pocket, and there was no particular reason to stop. That is not toughness, in the way that word usually gets used. As if toughness is a quality you have or don't have, something you are born with or build through suffering you chose to undergo. It is a habit. The habit of treating damage as a problem to be managed, rather than a condition to be observed. You tape what needs taping, you leave what doesn't, you keep moving, because stopping costs more than the wound does. Krathsev had spent 41 days looking for evidence of that habit in the wrong place. He was looking for the mark. The habit does not leave a mark. The habit leaves a scar. Eventually, the scar is incidental. The point is not to accumulate the proof. The point is to stay functional long enough for the thing you are doing to be finished. I do not know what the houses made of his reports in the long run. I know the operational picture at Keth Haran changed over the year that followed our rotation. The joint exercises that came after us involved more genuine coordination and less of the careful courtesy that is indistinguishable from condescension when you have been on the receiving end of it for long enough. The next human unit that rotated in, I was told by someone who had served in it, found Krathsev on station, and found him asking different questions from the first day. Not questions about visible marks. Questions about process, about decision-making, about how a unit absorbs damage and keeps working. Questions. That is enough. It is more than I expected, standing in a noon-lit yard on day 41 with a taped knuckle and a ledger that needed settling. I reach into the breast pocket sometimes, when the roll is there, and feel the smooth backing paper of the tape against my fingers, and think about the yard. The flat noon light, the flagstone hot through my boots, 63 people not breathing, Krathsev's pale amber eyes moving from my face to my hand and settling on 2 strips of white tape and the thin red line at the seam, and the word he said in his own language, to no one in the yard and to the record that did not yet exist. Witnessed. That is all it was. 2 strips of tape on a split knuckle. A wound already answered, already back at work. Free. Already in the pocket for the next time, because there is always a next time, and the point has never been to commemorate the last one.